Hello my dear friends, hope you are all doing great. I am back with this series. Sorry for the late, now let's start our story. Diana told Emperor Karl, "Your Majesty, the Empress, is at Balder Manor." Karl's movements halted at Diane's whisper. It seemed that was the very thing that had been agitating his heart. Diana tilted her head, her tears clinging to the corners of her eyes. Shishithan spoke, "Where else would she be? By now, I'm sure the Empress is spending the night with him." Her words, spoken in a voice as enchanting as an incantation, contorted her exquisite face into a mess of anguish. Diana approached him. She settled beside him, cradling his neck in her arms and gently stroking his hair as she whispered, "Yes, the Empress is spending the night with him." Enough. Karl's tone grew ominous, but this time, Diana did not retreat. She thought, "My love belongs solely to you. I have no intention of sharing any part of myself with that woman. I will pursue you without hesitation, using any means necessary, and I will not give her even a single truck of yours." Diane tilted her head against his shoulder and whispered as if casting a spell, "Your Majesty, I am the only one by your side. I am the only one who truly understands you. You must not allow yourself to be consumed by thoughts of that woman, it is wrong." Meanwhile, Lionel, who was worried about the Empress, who had not emerged from the study after a simple dinner, paced nervously in front of the study door before cautiously knocking. There was no response, even after 2 consecutive knocks. Braving the impoliteness, he opened the door. After a moment, "Lionel," a cool voice, as chilling as the autumn wind, could be heard from behind the door. Adele, holding a glass of wine, awkwardly smiled at Lionel as he entered the family quarters. He spoke, "You're sneaking a drink without permission." It was a small cart with a bottle of contraband and a glass, from which Adele had already consumed 2 glasses of wine. Adele broke into a cold sweat at the sudden appearance of the unexpected landlord. Approaching with a slight stern expression, Lionel asked outright, "How many glasses is this for you?" "2 glasses," she replied. He continued, "Would you like another glass?" "Yes, please," she replied. He inquired, "Are you having trouble sleeping again?" "No," she replied. "I just felt like drinking today." He continued, "Having trouble sleeping and wanting to drink. It's not good if you keep doing that." She laughed then replied, "Wasn't the advisor babbling about irrelevant things?" He asked, "Didn't you say there's no such thing as a counselor in Gotrov?" She continued, "Well, why wouldn't there be? It's just that the meaning is slightly different." As Adele reached for the bottle, Lionel preemptively held it and poured wine into the glass. Adele looked at the flowing liquid with a pouting expression and scolded him. "Advisor, pour some more. You don't need to dilute it further. This amount is sufficient," he said. She replied, "Why are you judging my drinking capacity? Pour me some more. Today, I plan to drink until I become a drunken mess." As the intoxication coursed through her veins, a warmth spread throughout her body. Adele unfastened 2 buttons of her tightly cinched collar, finding some relief in the slight breeze. She leisurely leaned back against the sofa, savoring the languid exhilaration. Lionel, captivated, stared at her in a daze. Unbeknownst to him, his wandering gaze landed on her slender, graceful neck, and he felt an inexplicable heat engulf him. Then she said, "Lionel, I've managed to obtain 2 glasses today. Do you want the payment for the alcohol?" Adele's words caused Lionel to lower his gaze abruptly. His handsome face hardened, and a faint crease appeared between his brows. Adele chuckled. "Enough with the stern expression. Sometimes you do that when you see me." He attempted to raise his head and offer a retort. She continued, "I understand. The position of my counselor is not an honorable one. But don't worry." "What?" he asked. Adele smiled, her eyes narrowing, as she reassured him with a firm tone. "I will protect your honor. When you decide to step down as my counselor, I will make the announcement myself." He looked puzzled and asked, "What on earth are you saying?" Adelaide emphasized her words with a wry smile and a confident tone. The relationship between Adelaide, the Empress, and Lionel Balder was purely official. Based on mutual trust, without any personal involvement. "Well, I'm not sure if that will restore your honor, but it's better than doing nothing, right?" "So, Stop with the stern expression. Even handsome faces develop wrinkles, you know. As Lionel contemplated the Empress's words in silence, he suddenly rose from his seat and approached the cabinet. He took one of his own glasses, returned with it, and poured himself a drink. Huh, are you drinking it straight? Don't you dilute it. It's toxic. As Adele tried to intervene, standing up from her relaxed position, Lionel chuckled, seemingly bewildered. He replied, even if I tell you it's toxic, you've already downed it yourself. What are you saying? He swallowed his pride along with the words, taking a sip of the alcohol. Ah, it's strong, Your Majesty, the Empress. If I were someone who valued honor greatly, I wouldn't have agreed to become your counselor in the first place. Would I, a native of Emont, not know what a counselor is and what role they play? Adele squinted her eyes, furrowing her brow slightly. She scrutinized Lionel's gaze, expression, and demeanor, trying to grasp the meaning behind his words. After a moment of silence, Adele tilted her head and whispered, Lionel, do you want to become my lover? Lionel was taken aback by the words of the Empress, who spoke without filtering her thoughts. Your Majesty, what I mean is, well, she asked. He continued, I want to say that you don't need to worry excessively about my honor. She replied, a Minister of Defense should not disregard their own honor. That's not humility, but listen to me. So, what I mean is, you are the Minister of Defense, and I am the Empress of this country. Although we may appear to others as having no honor or anything, at the very least, we should respect each other's honor when we're together. That's what I'm saying right now. Adele reconsidered her words and let out a deep sigh, shaking her head slightly. That's nonsense. Lionel lowered his gaze with a stern face at her words. She felt tipsy, so she gets up to take some water. But then she tripped. And Lionel catches her. Adele tilted her head and looked at his face. A straight forehead, beautiful eyebrows, sharp and long eyes, a straight and prominent nose, slightly parted red lips. Adele suddenly thought that Lionel was quite handsome. However, perhaps due to the effects of alcohol, her gaze kept being drawn to his tightly pressed lips. As her gaze lingered on his red lips, it slid down along his sharp jawline and rose again along his cheek, and at that moment, his jet black eyes and hers met. Their gazes entwined. The golden red light reflected in their pupils, as if possessing a captivating power that could not be averted. The tense atmosphere evaporated like dew. She thought they both were too close and this situation seemed pretty dangerous. Adele opened her mouth in a light voice. Thank you so much. It seems like I am too drunk. And, I understand. You didn't come all this way just to become my lover. That's why I'm saying the same thing. She replied, I said I would help with whatever you want, right? Yes. He replied. She continued, that was very reassuring. I won't betray you either. He replied, I will never betray your Majesty either. A low, locked voice flowed into Adele's ears. Meanwhile in the Imperial Palace. At this moment, the Empress is probably spending the night with Lionel Balder. Diane's whisper stuck to Carl's ears like sticky mud, refusing to let go. Carl looked down at Diane, who leaned against his shoulder, with a cold gaze, then slowly pushed her shoulder back. Diane's face turned desolate. Your Majesty, she called him, but he ignored her. Diane's face turned pale as she noticed the Emperor furrowing his brow. Her heart raced loudly. Carl immediately stood up and walked towards the bed, leaving her behind. Diane's heart grew cold, and without realizing it, she reached out her hand. He then said, get out. Despite Carl's displeasure, he felt annoyed that Diane didn't go to her room. And the next day, Carl was awakened from his restless sleep by a faint knock. He forcefully opened his eyes. At that moment, a servant cautiously knocked on the door and entered the bedroom. Carl glanced at the servant and asked in a half-hearted voice. What's the matter? Your Majesty, the Empress, has returned, the servant replied. In that instant, Carl sprang out of bed as if he had been thrown off it. And as if eagerly waiting for that news alone, he hurriedly left the room. The Empress's palace had a subtly different atmosphere. Adele immediately grasped the reason behind it. It was the maids. Up until now, the maids had cautiously kept their distance from Adele, approaching only when they had to attend to certain tasks, then swiftly retreating like frightened rabbits. But within a few days, it seemed that they had assessed the situation and all came forward to greet Adele. Adele intuitively realized that Diane Poiters had withdrawn from the Ivory Palace during her absence. "You have arrived, Your Majesty." One maid approached, struggling to offer a respectful greeting, and other maids joined in, asking, "Shall we prepare warm water? Would you like to freshen up?" Adele glanced at them discreetly, then tilted her head and smiled. Startled by the Empress's smile, the maids quickly bowed their heads and took a step back. This was the extent of Adele's relationship with them. She replied, "Yes, that's right. Please go ahead and prepare warm water." After giving the order in a slow tone, Adele turned around neatly. Lady Giggs rushed forward. Lady Giggs said, "Thanks to you, I was able to pass the time comfortably." Empress spoke, "I'm glad to hear that. Each of you, go about your tasks. Don't follow me." Adele pushed past the maids and entered her room with Lady Giggs. As Lady Giggs handed her the outer robe, she whispered softly in Adele's ear. "Diane Poitiers, the Countess of Ivory, has moved from the Ivory Palace to the guest rooms in the Imperial Palace. I have arranged the staff accordingly for the guest rooms. Please confirm." As Lady Giggs fully removed the robe and took a step back, Adele removed her gloves and placed them on the table. "As I expected. Very well, for now. That should suffice," she said. "I have also corrected the address issue." Lady Giggs replied, "Thank you. Was there anything else of note?" Empress inquired. Lady Giggs replied, "There was nothing particularly significant, but a direct attendant of His Majesty the Emperor persistently asked about Your Majesty's whereabouts." Before Lady Giggs could finish speaking, hurried footsteps were heard. The Emperor forcefully pushed and opened the door. Adele thought to herself how many times she had already seen such a terrifying sight. The Emperor, with the fierce expression on his face, he entered, in the Empress room without any hesitation. Adele sensed the reason for his visit in his rough appearance. Because of the Ivory Palace matter, Diane Poitiers. In that brief moment, she prepared herself for the Emperor's questioning. He then said, "Where were you?" However, his low growling question, as he approached closely, was slightly different from what she expected. The Empress furrowed her brow slightly as she looked up at the Emperor. His deep purple eyes examined every corner of Adelaide without missing a single detail. She then answered him, "I have already given my answer to that." As Adele turned away from him, Carl grabbed her shoulder and pushed her against the desk. Adele instinctively pushed him away forcefully with her shoulder and became angry. She asked, "What are you doing?" He continued, "Were you with Lionel Balder?" Adele was speechless in the face of his relentless obsession. From such a close distance, Carl stared into Adele's eyes. Suddenly, Adele was filled with intense anger towards the Emperor, who had come uninvited and treated her like a criminal. She then replied, "And what if I was? What does it matter? Haven't we agreed not to care about each other?" As the impulse surged through the Emperor's reddening chest, Adelaide's ice-cold voice spread like winter frost. He then spoke, "What does it matter? Because you, who should be the mother of my child, might end up having Bald's child. Behave yourself. What will you do if I don't recognize your child as mine?" At his heated words, Adele chuckled sarcastically. "Thought is it romance if you do it, but an affair if I do? What nonsense." As it was, he wanted to tilt his head and kiss her red lips. That's what Carl thought as he was about to lean in, but a stubborn voice stopped him in his tracks. "Do you think you can make me surrender like this?" Adele pushed his body away with one hand and spoke with disdain. "If you want to tame me, try tempting me with things I like instead of clumsily pushing your body against mine. So, when I'm completely enchanted, you can gently and carefully put that loose leash around my neck. Make sure I never find out." The fierce will of someone born to be a king surged like waves and struck Carl's ear. The dark night hung at the tip of his fingers, the waves tapping at his ear. The pale golden moon and the faint scent of blooming spring flowers mixed in their breath were distant. A flash-like moment passed through Carl's mind. His lips roamed close to Adele's lips. Just before their plump lips could touch, Carl narrowed his eyes and slowly parted his red lips. It was his first smile since facing Adele. Like a blossoming flower, the Emperor's laughter was so radiant and innocent that it even momentarily captivated Adele. Just as she was about to come to some conclusion, the Emperor tilted his head back and took a step back. And while she was off guard, he gently tucked away a strand of her black hair that had fallen over her ear. When his fingers brushed against her earlobe, Adele furrowed her brows, and Karl politely withdrew his hand and took another step back. He spoke, "You must be tired, take rest. I will come back another time." Then, he silently turned his body. His footsteps were so aristocratic that Adele watched him in astonishment. The Emperor's abrupt arrival was as sudden as his departure. What was that? What on earth is he doing? Left alone, Adele mumbled in disbelief. Is he crazy? Anyway, he's unpredictable and uncontrollable. In the afternoon of that day, merchants suddenly crowded into the Empress's palace. The maid-servants, who had already dealt with them once, tried to stop them with annoyance. Maid asked, "Why on earth are you coming here without being called?" Then, the representative of the merchants opened his eyes wide and spoke in a self-assured tone. "His Majesty, the Emperor. We've been sent by him." The Empress was busy with piles of books brought from the study and didn't seem to have a moment to spare. Lady Giggs told to Empress that the merchants were sent by Emperor. Her hand, which was turning the pages of the book, paused for a moment as the Empress raised her head. Then she firmly expressed her refusal. "Send them away. I don't need anything," said the Empress. Lady Giggs replied, "But Your Majesty," the lady-in-waiting persisted. The Empress continued, "I really don't understand. Why would they come running here, especially after causing so much trouble? When they left, the atmosphere was quite amiable. Fighting and bickering, that's what they did. But why? I don't get the reason for this at all. There was no such atmosphere. If he weren't the Emperor, Adele would have sarcastically asked, is he out of his mind?" The Empress said, "I don't need anything, and I don't want to accept anything. Send them away. It's barely been a week since the supplementary budget was rejected. Isn't this some kind of mockery?" Lady Giggs replied, "Is there a need to refuse the extended hand so forcefully? It might harm the imperial favor, after all." Annoyed, Adele let out a sigh and splashed some water on her face. She thought it would have been much easier and more comfortable to destroy the tower instead. She couldn't understand the Emperor's feelings, but Lady Giggs, who had been pondering for a moment, suggested a solution. If she sent the merchants away, it would directly challenge the Emperor's will, and it wouldn't benefit the Empress. However, if she accepted the gift forcefully and didn't want it, then Lady Giggs spoke, "How about buying gold instead?" Hearing the word gold, the Empress's eyes narrowed. It was a truly high-level idea that suited the experienced chief administrator of the imperial palace. Adele opened the statement she held in her hand and checked the amount. The figure written on it far exceeded the budget designated for gifts, making it clear that it was a mockery and not a genuine present. She read the letter sent by Emperor. "I have the ability to grant you a supplementary budget, but I won't. Instead, I'll give you a gift. Maybe some dresses or jewelry." Adele folded the bill and handed it to Mrs. Giggs, then turned her around and went into the room. The night the Empress went back to the palace, Lionel lay on the bed and tossed and turned for a while before getting up nervously. It was to the point of doubting that he had insomnia, which he hadn't had before. Lionel was sitting on the bed, thinking about something. What the hell is this, and why is it doing this? After thinking and not getting an answer, he changed his direction. "What do you want to do right now?" It was a question of desire. Then, an answer sprang out from within him so quickly that he was lost for a long time. Something red from under his chest slipped out of his front paw. Dark blue eyes narrowed tight as they looked out the window. Desire stepped out one more step. The golden eyes reflected the shimmering light, the neat and pretty face, and the cold and small hands. She must be at the palace right now, safe. He unconsciously went to his family room, where he and Empress has little chat. As he opened the door, leaving behind the tumultuous emotions in his chest, a familiar space greeted him. With every deep breath he took, it seemed like her scent was mixed in somehow. Lionel was not someone who usually enjoyed strong alcohol, yet there was a bottle of strong liquor in his hand. He sat on the couch and gazed at the spot where Adele had been sitting. Why had he come here, wanting to retrace his steps? Her words, actions, and even the tiniest expressions vividly replayed in his mind, each one so clear and meaningful. They hadn't flowed by unconsciously. It was because his entire focus had been sensitively fixated on her. Lionel, do you want to become lovers with me? Suddenly, at the memory of her cool voice, his heart raced again. He knew it wasn't a romantic intention, but the thrill that had started in his head at those words quickly spread to his toes. Why did he thrill at that question? Why did he keep replaying that moment when they had looked into each other's eyes as if entranced? Lionel's brows twisted into a mess. You must be crazy, he muttered in frustration, releasing the glass he had been holding and touching his forehead. No matter how long he sighed, the frustration wouldn't disappear. He felt like he was going insane. Facing a corner of his desire that he had been ignoring for so long brought forth an overwhelming sense of disappointment. Lionel. A cool voice, like an autumn breeze, echoed in his ears like an auditory illusion. Lionel. Lionel shook his head once, abruptly stood up, and hastily left the family room. After quickly closing the door behind him, he leaned against it, took a deep breath, and closed his eyes with a heavy heart. Then, he admonished himself. Snap out of it. Lionel chuckled in frustration. The belated realization flashed through his mind like a lightning bolt. When the Empress announced the official announcement about the royal court, why did he think he needed to go himself? He had never considered sending someone from another family in his place. As soon as he saw the announcement, he decided he must respond directly and then came up with a reason afterward. He brushed away any thoughts that it was strange. The reason he had concocted for himself seemed plausible. In truth, he had been overwhelmed and captivated by the dazzling light he had encountered for the first time. If someone who's the Minister of Defense doesn't care about their own honor, it's not right. At the very least, let's respect each other's honor. With Adele's voice in mind, Lionel closed his eyes and lowered his head slowly. Honor. The Empress was a person who never let go of her dignity and honor, even in the most difficult moments. To her, honor might be something as valuable as life itself. So, his desire would chip away at her honor. Others might not know, but Adele was undoubtedly thinking that way. Just as he had confessed to the Empress, he would never betray her. Thinking of the Empress's noble and elegant face, Lionel suppressed his desires and regrets. While leaving the room he thought that he will never betray Empress' trust. The next morning, a considerable number of people gathered at the Empress's palace. This time, they weren't merchants. A group of guards, court officials, and maid-servants dressed immaculately had assembled in the palace courtyard. The Empress's palace momentarily buzzed with activity. Mrs. Giggs hurriedly went out, conversed with the head of the group, and returned. They are the people sent by His Majesty the Emperor. Adele looked out the window at the people waiting beyond. Then she said, yesterday it was money, today it's manpower. Why on earth have they come now? Lady Giggs replied, the Emperor sent them, saying that there are too few personnel to assist you in your tasks. Adele chuckled at herself. The budget deficit seemed to show that they had no intention of providing more resources. Lady Giggs asked, what should we do? The Empress asks, as one of the options to refuse them. That would be unwise, wouldn't it? Lady Giggs replied. Then Empress Adele had an idea. She spoke, don't give them anything to do. The number of guards is excessive, so send half of them back. As for the court officials and maid-servants, don't burden them unnecessarily with tasks, just let them assist the maid-servants with their current duties. That should be sufficient. Yes, I will follow your instructions, Lady Giggs replied. In response to the Empress's sharp words, Mrs. Giggs bowed her head respectfully. And Duke d'Espun has sent someone to request a meeting. They want to know your convenient time to visit. What should we do? Duke d'Espun. Adele thought for a moment and then replied. It's fine. Tell them to come at their convenience. Yes, I understand, Your Highness. Then Lady Giggs leaves the room. Upon hearing the news, Duke Despun arrived at the Empress's palace. Duke Despun greeted Adele with an overly friendly expression. "Your Majesty, have you been well? Please have a seat, Duke Despun." Adele responded with a smiling face. He continued, "Our Empress is a capable sorceress. You must feel secure beyond measure." Adele chuckled. Duke Despun having proposed, "Would you come to the Sorcerers Guild once?" She replied, "If I go, wouldn't the situation get even stranger in the picture?" "Isn't that right? I've heard that the Egmont Sorcerers Guild provides accreditation and ranks at the same time. If I receive accreditation, what rank will you grant me? Will you grant me the position of director?" "Ah ha ha," he chuckled. Duke Despun seemed to have realized this now, tapping his own palm, while Adele gazed at him with an expression of amusement. After sizing up the Empress for a moment, Duke Despun leaned closer and inquired in a subtle tone. "Your Majesty, why do you seek to join forces with House Balder?" Seeing Adele's eyes widen in surprise and her expression suggest she didn't understand, Duke Despun continued with a slightly lowered voice. "Why do you insist on taking the difficult path when you have me?" "What do you mean?" she asked. He continued, "Your Majesty, I am a member of the Ulrich House." "I am your family." "Family, that word," she replied. He continued, "Of course, Your Majesty, I'm aware of the difficulties you're facing. Please forgive me for only coming now. Diane Portier will be dealt with soon." "Is that so?" She was amazed at Duke's words. He continued, "Yes, of course. Ignorant and reckless people like her will be dealt with quickly." At that subtle and cruel whisper, Adele chuckled dryly. When Duke Despun's face stiffened, the Empress hurriedly stifled her laughter and apologized. "Oh, I'm sorry." "Not at all," he replied. She continued, "More importantly, since you've come this far, may I ask you a question? Will you listen?" "Ah, of course," he replied. She continued, "I'm truly curious, so I'm asking. Why do you just leave the tower there? As an Empress, I ask you. Why do you just let it be? What do you want to achieve by leaving it like that?" Adele whispered as if she knew everything, her expression revealing an air of confidence. She continued, "Leave that kind of talk to Diane Portier. I'm not interested in wielding power while carrying the Emperor's favor on my back. What I'm interested in is the core of true power. I have no need for leftovers that can be gained by standing beside it." Duke Despun's eyes grew intense. The man who had been closely examining Adele's face shed his gentle facade and spoke. Duke also countered a question, "Then, Your Majesty, do you have the intention to join forces with me and become the owner of the tower?" "How?" she asked. When the Empress asked with genuine curiosity, Duke Despun expanded his chest and responded firmly. "Your Majesty, that is a power that has descended from the heavens. By utilizing the tower well, you will gain not just power, but divine power. Your Majesty will become a god. Please believe only in me." Upon hearing those words, Empress Adelaide burst into a wide smile like a blooming flower. After their conversation, Duke left the room. Empress Adele expelled everything that was bothering her, not even eating. Her originally pale face turned ashen white, and her rosy lips lost their color. Even Mrs. Giggs, who had seemed unflappable at any moment, was taken aback and called for a physician as the Empress's condition rapidly deteriorated. Adelaide's state worsened so rapidly that she had even begun to hallucinate. The physicians hurriedly administered medication, and only then did her vomiting stop and her fever subsided. But that wasn't the end of it. When she touched her forehead, she realized that her fever was burning fiercely. Even after taking fever-reducing medicine, her temperature showed no sign of dropping. Lady Giggs asked from Doctor, "Why is this happening? She was fine just this morning. Could it be?" No, it doesn't seem to be something poisonous," the doctor replied. Lady Giggs asked, "Then why, all of a sudden?" Doctor continued, "Perhaps it's the result of accumulated stress from coming to a foreign country. Let's observe a little longer." Adele couldn't move a finger with her rapidly deteriorating health. Her esophagus felt like it was on fire, causing excruciating pain, and her whole body ached as if she had been beaten. In the midst of trembling in pain, she lost consciousness. The news of the Empress's collapse quickly reached the Emperor's ears. What? The Empress has collapsed. Yes, Your Majesty, the servant replied. He thought, that woman who had seemed as sturdy as a rock had collapsed. The Emperor narrowed his eyes and immediately stood up from his seat. I need to go see for myself. As if waiting for this very moment, the Emperor stormed out of the Imperial Palace and headed towards the Empress's palace. Consciousness drifted beneath the surface of slumber. Her body sank slowly, feeling languid. Ah, this isn't so bad either. Adele closed her eyes, withdrawing the strength from her entire body and shutting the eyes of her soul. There, she saw the people who had shared her purpose lined up one after another. They were all smiling kindly at her. Your Highness, please do what you believe is right. We will guard your back. The words resonated deeply in her chest. Adele reached out her hand towards them, attempting to draw closer. Take any one of us. Or else, we'll hide in Emont ourselves. Don't go. Your Highness, please don't go. Then her voice is heard. After all, walking alone is our path. You should walk your path. What's the point of unnecessary worry for those who have their duties to fulfill in Gothrov? Please, come with me. Don't follow. Damn it. Please, just say you'll come with me. No, no, hold on there. They smile. They smile while shedding tears. And then they slowly lower their heads. Adele struggled and resisted with sobs. Don't go, please, just me, I wasn't coming for you. Just one, even just one person, I should have brought. So I could have a breath of relief. Adele crumbled within her deep subconscious. As she was being sucked into that endless abyss, someone's voice penetrated her ears like a lie. Yes. Adele blinked her eyes slowly. Then a sincere voice echoed clearly. Whatever you desire, I will assist you. That was Lionel's voice. Empress Adelaide had collapsed and lost consciousness, and upon hearing the news, Emperor Karl rushed to the Empress chamber in a single stride. Entry by outsiders was strictly prohibited, but he was no outsider. Karl confidently stepped into the Empress chamber. There, on the bed, lay the Empress. Her feverish face was unbelievably hot and pale. Despite having taken fever-reducing medicine and somewhat lowering her temperature, this delicate woman didn't emit even a single whimper. Her parted lips continued to release hot breath incessantly. It was as if flickering flames might be visible beneath her translucent and fragile eyelashes. Then, at some point, her labored breathing beneath those silky, fluttering eyelashes became rougher. Empress. Caught off guard by the sudden situation, Karl called out to Adelaide while gently shaking her shoulders. However, Adelaide continued to gasp in pain, her breath hitching. Then, from beneath her shimmering ebony eyelashes, something clear and delicate rolled down. A sob escaped through her lips, cracked from the fever. This woman as cold as ice, was crying. Karl stared at her as if enchanted. Gently enclosing her petite face with his cautiously outstretched hand, he felt the warmth transmit through his touch. It was like his hand was melting against her skin. Labored breaths barely held back, a face drenched in tears. Adelaide. Karl called her name like an incantation, his tone gentle and tender. Adelaide. If she wasn't content with just that, it was acceptable. He had to possess her sooner or later, without any clear indication of when he'd calm down. If slipping a leash around her without her realizing it proved too difficult, he'd have to erect an unseen barrier. Creating a broad fence that didn't make her feel trapped, he had to figure out what he truly desired. After a moment of contemplation, he brushed aside his passing worries. After all, he was the Emperor, with the power to possess whatever he wanted. He muttered, Adelaide Ulrich belongs to Karl Ulrich. Do you understand? Lionel received news of the Empress' illness on the same afternoon. Secretary Michael Rosen, who was overseeing the Duke's affairs, had come to inform Lionel of the news. While the details aren't clear, the Empress Palace is in turmoil. The chief physician has been going back and forth at least 5 times, but it seems Her Majesty is still unconscious. Unconscious? Do you know how serious the Empress' condition is? Could she be poisoned? Minister, tell me as much as you know. Michael Rosen narrowed his eyes and tilted his head, not giving the response Lionel had expected. While they were talking, a servant opened the door and informed Lionel that a maid came from Empress Palace. What's the matter? Lionel asked, slightly rising from his seat. The maid struggled to catch her breath and spoke. Her Majesty, the Empress, requests your presence. His heart surged at her words. He was shocked to know that the Empress wanted to see him. Without asking any further questions, he stormed out of the room, leaving the maid behind, her eyes following his hurried departure. The Empress had forbidden anyone else from entering. Lady Giggs, the maids, and even the hands of the court officials trying to check on her condition were turned away. Only one person had been granted entry. As Lionel, who had rushed without pause, arrived at the Empress's palace. Lionel, without hesitation, pushed open the door and entered the room. The Empress lay on the bed. Instead of sitting in the provided chair, Lionel knelt by the edge of the bed, revealing the Empress's face directly in front of him. She still had her eyes closed. As she opened her eyes, Lionel was there. Adele extended her trembling hand toward him with all the strength she could muster. Lionel, looking somewhat taken aback by her extended hand, glanced at it. However, Adele had no room to spare for assessing his feelings right now. With the resolve to catch a flying wisp, her outstretched hand finally reached him. She spoke. I can call only you by name here. I can ask only you. Who I feel can carry out this request. In Gotrov, send someone, anyone will do, even just one person to me. Bring them to me. Seeing the tears in the Empress's eyes, Lionel's mind snapped into focus. He then spoke. You want someone sent to Gotrov, someone you're asking for. I'll search for them, I'll call for them, I'll spread the word. Who do you want? She replied. Kane Knox, Gabrielle Lujan, Theodore Siniak, anyone is fine. Anyone, it doesn't matter. Just one person, anyone, if I call for them, they will come. The conviction in her crimson and golden irises, a solid trust, sent a shiver down Lionel's spine. Tears, infused with deep yearning, forged paths down her cheeks. Lionel stared at the Empress with deep-set eyes and slowly inquired. Why do you want to summon them? He inquired. She continued, because I feel like I'm going to die. That's why. She cried endlessly while uttering those words, as if unaware that she was crying. Lionel was at a loss for words, so he remained kneeling, holding his breath. The warm hand that had touched his cheek slowly lost strength and fell. Then suddenly she spoke. No, don't bring them. Pretend you didn't hear it, Lionel. Then she thought, for my sake, I can't ask someone to abandon their family. With those thoughts, the Empress closed her eyes. Startled, Lionel hurriedly checked her breathing. The Empress was breathing faintly but steadily. As he took a deep breath of relief, an indescribable emotion overcame Lionel. He held her in his arms. He thought, Kane Knox, Gabrielle Lujan, Theodore Siniak. Those names he had never heard clung to his ears like glue, refusing to let go. The weight of the trust he received from Empress. How strong was it? What kind of faith had passed between them and this unknown group? Bang! The door abruptly swung open, and Lionel jolted to his feet. Who dared to enter the Empress's sleeping quarters? The Emperor shouts. What are you doing, Lionel Balder? Though news of the Empress' collapse had been kept a secret, but the rumors were already spread. On the evening of the day Empress Adelaide fainted, the news reached Diane's ears as well. However, there was something else that intrigued her. Where is His Majesty the Emperor? When Diane inquired, the attendant didn't seem the least bit uncomfortable as he replied. He is in the Empress's chamber. Why in the world? Inside, Diane silently screamed, but externally, she couldn't reveal a trace. The palace servants, who had always been attentive to Diana's moods, had started changing their attitudes in the blink of an eye over just a few days. It wasn't just the palace servants. The number of those who no longer tried to accommodate her preferences steadily grew. A few years ago, when she first stayed in the guest quarters of the Emperor's palace at his summons, she hadn't received treatment worse than this. Back then, someone emerged from the Emperor's chamber. Diane had looked at the fleeting figure, quickly turning her gaze away in urgency. She had stared obstinately at his retreating. The refined profile, the elegantly tied golden hair, a maid subtly shifted her direction, inadvertently turning to meet Diane's eyes. Diane bit her lip and swiftly turned, striding away. She thought, a blonde with blue eyes young lady. Meanwhile in Empress' chamber, Lionel turned with a defensive posture, but upon seeing the person who had entered, he froze. As a furious beast trespassed into his territory, Emperor Karl Ulrich appeared slowly. Lionel Balder. Karl's face displayed anger as he appeared before them. Lady Giggs quickly answered, trying to hide her unease, and Karl took a deep breath. He stared at Lionel as if ready to pierce him with his gaze and took it step by step. Lionel, rather audaciously, didn't avert his gaze and faced him squarely. Karl, in his mind, wanted nothing more than to throw this man out of here. He wanted to know what this insignificant person was doing here. Karl turned his attention to the sleeping Adele. She closed her eyes as if she had never awakened before. Is it true that the Empress woke up? It doesn't seem like it. Emperor inquired. It seems like she woke briefly and fell asleep again. Lady Giggs replied. Lady Giggs, who had been alternating her gaze between Karl and Lionel, whispered to Lionel in a hushed voice. Perhaps it's time for you to leave. Her call was like a whisper, underlaid with a somber tone. No, stay there for now, the Emperor ordered. Lionel turned slowly, as if drawn by some unseen force, as the Emperor's sharp gaze bore into his imposing figure and issued a command. Karl examined Lionel's expression with a persistent gaze. In return, Lionel Balder also met the Emperor's stern gaze with a resolute face. He wants to pluck Lionel I because he saw in such state. However, Karl keenly sensed a fleeting moment when Lionel's gaze briefly flickered towards the Empress. The author is scrutinizing my Empress. Karl's primal instinct reached a swift conclusion. As a sense of impending danger rapidly spread through his spine, his entire body tensed. Show me clearly whose possession this woman is. Karl deliberately put on a composed expression, leisurely gazing at the Empress. He watched as she lay halfway on the bed. The Emperor commanded, "Aide, fetch a damp cloth." His command was delivered with an intimidating tone. The order sent Lady Giggs scrambling to respond, her reaction swift like a drawn spring. Your Majesty, she began, but the Emperor cut her off with a single sharp phrase. Aren't you the Empress's attendant? This should be within your capabilities. His words left Lady Giggs flustered and her protests stifled. The Emperor's gaze, fixed on the unyielding Lionel, seemed to convey his disapproval. All eyes in the room, the courtiers and servants who had been waiting outside the Empress's chamber, now turned their collective attention toward Lionel. In that moment, Lionel couldn't help but feel the pitiful and absurd nature of his position. The Emperor had deliberately issued this command to showcase the shallow nature of the relationship between Lionel and the Empress. So, there was no need to waver, and in fact, there was no real reason to waver, right? Yet why was his heart swaying like a reed in the wind, and why was it so difficult to breathe, as if he were buried beneath a mound of earth? Lionel struggled to quell his precarious emotions and reached for a towel that had been prepared in a corner. The Emperor maintained his icy demeanor, his gaze fixed on Lionel with an expression of mild annoyance, before roughly accepting the towel. He then turned his attention to the sleeping Adele, carefully wiping her face as though handling delicate glasswork. His touch was cautious and delicate, like that of a craftsman working on a fragile masterpiece. Lionel watched this scene unfold without daring to blink, as if he wanted to etch it into his very retina. After a moment, as Adele's face, once damp with sweat and tears, was restored to its pristine state, Karl emerged from the bed with a satisfied expression. He approached Lionel, who stood nearby, and pressed the slightly warm towel against Lionel's chest, whispering in a satisfied tone. The Emperor spoke, "From now on, when the Empress is asleep, wait outside the door. Understand?" After that, leaving the Empress' residence behind, Lionel returned to his own office and locked the door behind him. Despite exhaling the breath he'd been holding and attempting to calm himself, his chest still felt constricted. Lionel's trembling hands undid the buttons of his shirt, and he slowly unfastened them. He closed his eyes tightly, attempting to quell his raging heart, yet that scene flashed before his mind's eye: the Emperor seated on the Empress's bed, leaning casually as if it were the most natural thing in the world. They were a married couple. It wasn't uncommon for the Emperor to attend to the Empress, but that didn't mean it wouldn't draw criticism. Yet, at that moment, seeing that image, Lionel felt an overwhelming urge to scream in frustration. Do you know how she views this place as if it were hell? Continuously wiping away his confused expression, he clenched his teeth tightly. It had been just a day since he vowed to suppress his desires and never let them surface again. Continue the conversation we were having earlier. As Carl left the Empress's residence, he spoke to the courtier who followed him. By the time he heard the news that the Empress had woken up. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to gather information about the situation inside the palace. And, did they share a room or not? Emperor inquired. They seem to have used separate rooms. The servant replied. The servant continued, also, 2 days ago, she visited the slums beyond the Niavara River. Carl, lost in thought with a furrowed brow, stopped in his tracks. The slums. The servant continued, yes. It seems she stayed there for about 2 hours. According to the boy who guided the Empress, she inspected the interior of the houses in the slums. Who was with her? Emperor asked. Lionel Balder was with her. The servant replied. The Emperor fell silent and lowered his gaze. When the Emperor returned to his office, Diane was waiting for him. As he entered, she rose from her seat and offered a cheerful smile. It was a habitual gesture. Are you here, Your Majesty? Although her greeting was warm, Carl only glanced at her with an indifferent gaze and wordlessly walked to his desk. His heart was as chilly as if a gust of wind had blown through. Diane bit her lip forcefully. Nevertheless, she composed herself, turning her body away and smoothing her expression. Do you have something to discuss? The Emperor, checking the pile of documents on his desk, inquired. His gaze and hands remained fixed on the papers. Diane grew anxious, interpreting it as a signal that he had no intention of discussing anything with her right now. Diana tried to approach the Emperor. But this time, the moment the servants carefully opened the side door, someone entered the Emperor's office. Diane's gaze slowly turned toward her. The shimmering blonde hair caught the sunlight and sparkled. A dignified and refined profile, and movements as gentle as a spring breeze. Diane held her breath and gazed at her. In the midst of a world frozen in time, there were only the maid and Diane. It felt as if only the two of them existed. The maid moved gracefully and approached the Emperor's desk, quietly beginning to organize the scattered documents. Her slender fingers danced across the papers like dancer. Her pupils, which quietly checked the documents, were the color of a pale sky, the same color as the young woman who had left the Emperor's room not long ago. A shock surged through Diane as if all the blood in her body had suddenly rushed downward. The sensation of her palms becoming moist in an instant, a shivering chill passing through her spine, she almost sank on the spot. The anxiety that always clung to her, tormenting her nights from behind, had finally revealed its true form. It was greater than the unease she had felt when facing the Empress. How many young women with blue eyes and blonde hair under 29 years old are there? The Emperor noticed her gaze and looked at her. Thank you for your hard work. It sounded tender somehow, tenderly heard. The maid tilted her head gently and, with a cheerful movement resembling a squirrel, strolled across the Emperor's office. Diane's gaze stubbornly stayed on her. Thud. Only after the door closed did Diane release the breath she had been holding. Then suddenly the Emperor spoke. If you have nothing to say, then leave, Diane. Diane asked in a voice that was almost teary. I think the attendant for the documents was changed. The one who worked here before seems to have had some issues. The girl who just left, she seemed meticulous. Actually, the Empress has reassigned all the maids to different positions, so it's a bit inconvenient. She asked if she can get that maid for her since she had few people to work for her. The Emperor agreed. He said, fine, do whatever you want. The aide who was standing in office already knew why Diana wants that blonde maid for herself. Then she left the office and went to her chamber. Meanwhile, Lennox promptly responded to Diane's call. Seeing his sister after a few days, he could sense her unease. Why, what's the matter? He asked. I told you to manage the maids properly, didn't I? She shouts. What's gotten into you? He replied. She continued. You can't even do that properly. He replied. I told you. The Empress and Hannah Giggs have complete authority over all appointments. I can't do anything about hiring or dismissing people. Don't you understand? Finally, in a rough voice, she spoke up. The maid who used to manage the Emperor's documents will be reassigned to my division. So, I expect you to handle it. Are you out of your mind? Lennox shouts. I'm perfectly sane, she replied. He continued, she's an imperial palace maid, for heaven's sake. Diana interrupted him and said, who's going to kill her? I told her to take hush money and leave the capital. That should do the trick, right? Lennox let out a long sigh and shot an irritated glance. He continued, don't worry. If there's any sign that the Emperor intends to summon that maid to his chambers, I'll take care of it. Diana again interrupted him again. No, that's too late. I mean, we need to act before that. Diane couldn't possibly hold back any longer. Lennox turned away with a disgusted expression. And spoke, all right, I understand for now. She continued, it's not just for now, you must do it properly. Got it. Diane's voice persistently clung to Lennox as they exited the guest quarters. On that day, as twilight cast its shadow upon the land, a fair-haired maid, who had collected a substantial sum of money, was no longer dressed in her maid's attire. She had concealed herself beneath a deep hood and hurried away. Two figures, who had turned their robes inside out to hide themselves completely, watched her go. How long have they been waiting there? Should we inform them if something like this happens again? One of the Emperor's servants who had been starting in the direction of the woman, asked in a cautious voice. To Lady Giggs, and she nodded in response. And spoke, indeed, another maid like her will inevitably come in. Yes, understood, he replied. Eventually, the two of them turned and entered the palace. Diana asked from Lorraine, does that blonde maid leave the palace? In response Lorraine replied, yes, Your Highness. It seems she's packed her belongings and fled. Lorraine still addressed Diane as, Your Highness. As Diane listened to Lorraine's report, she tilted her head with a strange feeling. Suddenly, Diana spoke. Lorraine continued, yes, it seems she might have been frightened. Frightened. Lorraine nodded her head, and she continued, perhaps that's the case. Regardless, wasn't it what you wanted, Your Highness? Lorraine gently tried to soothe Diane. Yes, you're right, Diana replied. Try to relax. You need to be at ease for the baby's arrival. Lorraine spoke. Lorraine tactfully aligned with Diane's mood, and a while later, without warning, the Empress, who had been bedridden for several days, rose from her slumber just as unexpectedly as she had fallen. In the early morning, as Lady Giggs entered the Empress's room, she was startled to find the Empress seated halfway up in bed. Are you awake, Your Majesty? Lady Giggs spoke. The Empress's golden eyes, still clouded with sleep, slowly focused. Oh, how long have I been lying here? The Empress asked. You've been unconscious for 2 days, Lady Giggs replied. Adele nodded slowly. She then spoke. Would you like me to tidy your hair a bit? The Empress's matted and tangled hair from perspiration had become quite bothersome, so Adele offered her delicate assistance. Lady Giggs began gently brushing out the Empress's ebony locks with a comb. As the Empress's hair cascaded down her back. Did I happen to wake up in the middle of the night and summon Lionel Balder by any chance? Do you remember? Lady Giggs asked. I thought it was a dream, but it wasn't. Empress replied. Lady Giggs continued. During that time, even His Majesty the Emperor came. He's been quite worried. The palace physicians have been called in frequently, inquiring about the Empress's condition and the treatments they're giving. At the mention of the Emperor, Adele instinctively furrowed her brow. Unaware of this fact, Lady Giggs continued to tie the ends of her braided hair while speaking. Meanwhile Diane, who was on her way to Imperial office, witnessed the scene. She couldn't even summon the Emperor, who had not seen her, so quickly. However, when she saw how urgently the Emperor was heading somewhere, her heart, which had been in turmoil, suddenly began to pound loudly. She then asks from one of the servants. Has the Empress awakened? Oh, yes, that's correct, he replied. Did you just deliver that news? She inquired. Yes, he replied. The immediate response made it feel like the whole world had suddenly plunged into darkness. Diana felt as if her ears were ringing, and the ground was trembling beneath her. She would have nearly collapsed if it weren't for Lorraine's support. Diana struggled to regain her composure, gasping for breath. But suddenly, her chest tightened, and she began retching. She thought, the Emperor has gone to the Empress's palace. He went to see her now that she has regained consciousness. How can you do this to me? The Emperor arrived at the Empress chamber. Suddenly, Empress Adele appeared in front of him, backlit by the dazzling sunlight pouring in from behind. The radiant sunlight created a picturesque backdrop, causing Carl to come to a sudden stop. Welcome, Your Majesty. Adele greeted him with her low and cool voice, to which Carl responded, How is your health? She continued, Can't you tell just by looking? Then they both sat down for a tea. At that moment, Carl spoke. Did you ever lose consciousness like this when you were in Gotrov? No, she replied. He continued, but why suddenly? The council members also said they didn't know the cause. You should get regular checkups from them. All right, I'll do that, she replied. Although Adele silently grumbled inwardly, she didn't show it. Carl sat across from her and stared at her intently. He thought she is quite beautiful. Her already graceful face seemed even more refined, and her golden eyes appeared larger. With her hair swept to one side, the Empress gazed back at him with a pale, almost translucent complexion, typical of someone who had just awakened from illness. His persistent gaze made Adele feel uneasy. He thought she is completely unlike that woman. Carl slowly pronounced her name. Adelaide Ulrich Emont. Yes, I married you. You are my Empress. The day they first saw each other at the wedding venue, Adelaide became engraved in Carl's mind. A supremely Empress-like, delicate figure, a graceful demeanor. He thought it would ignite a desire to dominate. It was a misconception. No, it was more subtly different. If it had been just about wanting to dominate, he would have never lowered his head before Adelaide, regardless of the circumstances. Finally realizing his own heart, Carl smiled deeply. His face, as he closed his eyes and smiled, was astonishingly beautiful and enchanting. Like a flower with poison. Seeing him in deep thought, she called him, Your Majesty. Not understanding the emotional context, Adele tilted her head and furrowed her brows. Carl lowered his head, smoothing out his expression, and then he whispered in a low voice. I shouldn't keep someone who needs rest for too long. I simply came to see you after waking up. As the Emperor left and the door closed, Adele muttered blankly. I don't know what it is, but something is definitely not right. She growled and suddenly laughed, her eyes rolling. What was it? Why did he suddenly change his stance as if turning his hand over? I will build a very wide fence. You belong to me. The voice that came to mind felt like a dream and yet. Not quite. Lady Giggs entered the room. Your Majesty. Yes, Empress. When I was unconscious, the Emperor mentioned that he had come. Do you happen to remember what he said to me at that time? In response to the Empress's question, Lady Giggs lowered her head. She spoke, I apologize. I had withdrawn a bit, so. Why do you ask? No reason, Empress replied. Adele kept thinking without getting up from her seat. Lady Giggs, who had been observing the Empress, spoke as if she had peered into her thoughts. Lady Giggs continued, I don't know the reason, but it seems that Your Majesty has undergone a change in mood. Is it not a bad thing? When the Empress remained silent, Lady Giggs didn't press further. Firstly, it was certain that the Emperor's mood had changed. Like Lady Giggs had said, it might not be immediately bad, but it couldn't be trusted in the long run. One could never predict when a changed heart might change again for no reason. Secondly, she needed power. However, for the reasons she had considered earlier, she needed strength that came from herself rather than relying on the Emperor's love. On the first day at Balder Manor, the Duke had proposed that she be officially recognized as a sorceress. Lionel told Empress, if you are recognized as a sorceress, you will gain the right to speak as a sorceress, even to Empress. It would be even better if you could attend the Central Council. Currently, all rights to speak about the tower were monopolized by Duke d'Espagne and Lennox Portier, so no one could argue against what they did. She then told Lady Giggs to arrange the meeting with Duke de Spun. In the Blair mansion, Lionel's brother spoke. I don't know if you've heard, but Her Majesty the Empress has awakened. Lionel, who had risen with Theseus, paused at the news. It was his instinct sounding an alarm, urging him to get out immediately. Theseus tapped Lionel's shoulder without thinking, who had frozen in place and was holding his breath. Theseus continued, keep a close watch. If you judge it's dangerous, don't hesitate to step back. It's better to be swift in such situations, so you don't need to ask me. After a while Lionel spoke. If you are referring to my position as the Empress's aide, now is not the right time to quit. We need information about the towers. And she still wants more from me. Theseus muttered. Lionel, is that really the only reason that you don't wish to resign as her aide? Lennox also sensed the strange atmosphere in the palace. When he arrived at Diana's room, he thought, she wasn't feeling well, but still she is smiling brightly. But why? After a while he figured out and spoke. Are you pregnant? Our story ends, my dear friends. Thanks for watching. Please comment and like our video. This will help us.